Welcome to Maxwell Institute Conversations, special videocast episodes of the Maxwell Institute podcast, hosted by Terryl Givens and created in collaboration with Faith Matters Foundation. You can watch this episode in your podcast app, or if you're on the run, listen to the audio version. Thomas F. Rogers is a noted Latter-day Saint playwright, essayist, scholar, and a former BYU professor. He's written extensively on the relationship between reason and faith. The Neal A Maxwell Institute published a collection of his writings as part of our Living Faith book series. The book is called Let Your Hearts and Minds Expand, Reflections on Faith, Reason, Charity, and Beauty. Terryl Givens sits down to talk with Rogers about his deep interest in human connection, the family of God.
What can you say about discipleship as a kind of risk-taking venture?
It needs to be that for all of us. And the people we read about in Scripture, the prophets and others, apostles in the New Testament, they had to do that. They had to walk the razor's edge, as Christ himself did. And I think that we need more of that challenge. I think it's available to us if we respond.
Thomas F. Rogers joins Terryl Givens in this episode of Maxwell Institute Conversations.
Hello and welcome to Faith Matters Foundation's Conversations with Terryl Givens, a videocast devoted to exploring the experience of lived Mormonism as a catalyst to the abundant life and the public good. I am your host, and our guest today is playwright, linguist, and artist Thomas Rogers, and we're delighted to have you with us today, Tom.
Thank you. I'm very honored.
Well, I like to start by having my guests introduce themselves to the larger public, and so why don't we do it this way? Why don't we ask you what three things do you expect would probably be in your obituary?
Well, I rather think it will be like any other. They will recall the family relationships I have, who my parents were, and our family and children. And then probably what I've done professionally. I ended up being a teacher of Russian language and literature throughout my career. After switching at Yale in the graduate school, after 2 years at the Yale School of Drama, where I was writing plays. But that still stuck with me somehow.
It came back later.
It came back later, about 15 years later. And meanwhile, I made the mistake, I guess you could say, of taking one elective in the second year at the School of Drama, which was in Pushkin. It was a year-length course. We read his great novel in verse, which Tchaikovsky made use of, very faithful use of, for the libretto of his greatest opera, Eugene Onegin. And that turned my head. I had to go back to Russian. I had studied it as an undergrad is all. And never regretted it, even though I was, I think, maybe about a year away from a doctorate of fine arts in the theater
program.
But took another 8 years for me to get my degree in Russian, attending after 2 years Yale, then again at Georgetown University, where I first began to teach as well across town at Howard University and taught Russian and German. And then moved to the U of U for 3 years and that's my alma mater, intended to be there indefinitely, but the institution 40 miles to the south rolled out its red carpet and enticed me there. And that was a great thing, too. And I'll say a little bit more maybe later about the promptings that have caused me to make these choices along the way. So that accounts for what I did professionally. The third, I think, thing that the obituary would probably mention is my church callings.
Right. What were some of those?
It happened after I got, for the most part, after I got to the Y. I wasn't acquainted with the Y. I'd never really been there on that campus to speak of, till I did agree to go there. And I even, we were interviewed by apostles back then.
Right.
The faculty were, and it was LeGrand Richards who took me on. And finally I said to him, Brother Richards, tell me that this is a calling. And then I thought that would take care of it. I would be then obligated to go. And he said, no, it's just a job. So I had to make that choice, too. It was certainly a providential one, and lots of wonderful opportunities came along with that I don't think would have been the case at the U. Both in academic, I directed the honors program at BYU for a time, and ecclesiastical. I was the president of what was then called a student branch. Now they're student wards. Then for 3 years, branch president at the MTC. And never could have anticipated that I would ever, or even my students would have an opportunity to be missionaries in Russia itself till the fall of the Iron Curtain. And then all of a sudden they needed some mission presence over there, particularly those who knew Russian. And I'm sure that's the only reason I was called to do that. But no other school, if you were on the faculty, would say, go ahead and take 3 years off. We'll keep your position for you, but except for BYU.
So one of the first mission presidents in Russia.
Yes.
And then you returned for subsequent church service in Russia in your later years.
Oh, yes. Well, in fact, after retiring, Miriam and I, my wife and I, we were asked to teach for a year at Peking University, English, to graduate students in China. And that was memorable, too. And then shortly after that, we were called to the Swedish temple in Stockholm, because at that time, several church missions all sent their members to Stockholm to go to the temple. And they needed somebody to coordinate that. So that was for a year and a half. And then more recently, I was called to be Patriarch for all of Eastern Europe, one of a couple. And that lasted for 8 years. It took about a total of 25 transatlantic trips, 2 of them global circumnavigations. And after about 2,660 blessings, and about 3 to 5 trips a year, I had that great experience.
So you're well-traveled professionally and ecclesiastically, and I would say spiritually as well. In fact, I consider you kind of an encyclopedia of spiritual insights, Tom.
Oh, boy.
Many of which are collected in this wonderful collection, Let Your Hearts and Mind Expand, which I may be referring to a little bit later in our conversation. But I'd like to explore a little bit, if we could, your own spiritual formation. And one way I like to phrase this question is to refer to the poet Wordsworth, who in his great prelude wrote that there are in our existence spots of time.
Mm-hmm.
And he refers to the renovating virtue of those moments that are pivotal and foundational and formative. And I wonder if you could choose 2 or 3 moments in your life that shifted your direction.
Well, I hope that's true for everybody, that they have these spiritual promptings, which they don't even anticipate nor recognize as such. That has certainly been true in my case. I hear people, and I hear the admonition to people to search prayerfully and anxiously for answers. I haven't done that in too many instances. I haven't needed to, but the opportunity came, and the prompting, the suggestion somehow, willy-nilly, that I make a choice. And I had always to make that choice, and that's what led me to BYU, as a matter of fact. It's also what led me to switch from, I believe, from theater to Russian. And then there were a number of instances of that later, but even before, I was the president, the interchapter president of the church fraternity at the University of Utah in connection with the Institute of Religion, which was then called Lambda Delta Sigma for LDS. And its founder was Lowell Benyon, who was one of my great spiritual mentors, incidentally, and who was the director at the time as well at the U. And so I was very active in that organization, which would tend to suggest, would it not, that I was, totally with it spiritually. However, I certainly had no intention to serve a mission at that time, even into my senior year. My peers were called after their sophomore year, and they dutifully went. And I wasn't going to waste that 2 years or so on that. However, in that senior year, my bishop happened to be the manager of the Genealogical Society, or the archives of it. And he employed some of us in the ward to do part-time work at the archives on weekends, which I was doing. And why this didn't occur to me sooner, I don't know. I was very satisfied with my professors at the U. But I suddenly had a sense about so many of them that their religion was their discipline, and they were very good at it. But I said to myself, unexpectedly, one day sitting at the archives, life has to have more to it than just that, than just to pursue a particular academic or intellectual discipline. And so it caused me to rise from my desk, to go upstairs and knock on the office door of my bishop and ask him to call me on a mission, which he did, managed to do. And but that wasn't the end of that test. After I got to Germany, our mission was headquartered in Berlin. I wasn't there for very long before I realized for the first time I couldn't really be sure that the message I was bringing these people was divine and the truth. And without knowing that, I just could not continue. So I, even in desperation, wrote a letter to the apostle who had set me apart as a missionary, Hugh B. Brown. Fortunately, it was Hugh B. Brown. And he sent me a consoling letter, understanding, and made me sense something I'd been taught in primary, frankly, but I'd never really applied it seriously, and that was how you get a testimony. So and I also wrote another person, a young woman that I had known at the Institute of Religion. And why it was I selected her is also telling, I think. I didn't, but she wrote me back too, and that was very helpful. Well, anyway, weeks went by and nothing changed that much. I was desperate to. I wouldn't face my family and friends by going back if I had to stop being a missionary. I'd be too chagrined and embarrassed. So I had studied French as well as Russian. And I thought, I'll go to France, I'll join the Foreign Legion. Now, isn't that adolescent? I was in my early 20s already. But, that was how I was thinking to myself. Little realizing that had I done that a year later or so, I would probably have been in Algeria and been shot dead during that conflict. But I do so well remember the one morning when I was sitting by myself. Our missionary apartment was attached to the chapel in Hanover, which was my first assignment there. I was studying grammar and the scriptures and the discussions This is before we had an LTM or an MTC. And all of a sudden, I looked at the blank wall in front of me, and I knew. I just knew. There was no drama attached to that, no thunderbolt from Zeus. It had come for me. And that's over 60 years ago. I cannot dismiss the memory of that, or the confidence and the certainty that came with that realization. It made all the difference. Also, then I was prompted to write a letter just shortly after that to that young woman, sending her my Lambda Delta Sigma President's pin, since I didn't have a ring for her. I still had it was a 2.5-year mission, which language missions were then. And on great faith, she had to wait for me to return. We were married 9 days after my return in the Salt Lake Temple. We were sealed there by Apostle Richard L. Evans.
Lovely.
So that's another instance of this. Now, I'll just quickly cite 2 more, if I may. And they seem very strange and very irrelevant in a spiritual sense, but I had forgotten that I'd even written a play while I was so busy, involved in teaching Russian, and particularly Russian literature, until a colleague of ours in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages, Alan Keel, making a presentation to the College of Humanities at BYU, to the faculty on one occasion, which I attended, suddenly, and he was citing what 2 very famous post-World War II German novelists had written in favor, very favorable toward the young German martyr who was LDS, who was beheaded by Hitler at age 17 for protesting Hitler. Helmut Hubener, yes. And these 2 novelists had, in turn, in their work, both Nobel Prize-winning novelists, Günter Grass and Heinrich Böll, cited Hubener and the affair regarding him very in glowing terms. And suddenly, Alan turned and pointed at me in the audience, knowing about my background at Yale, I guess, and said, "Tom, you should write a play about that." And yes, another prompting in that form. A light bulb went on. I was then honors program director. I was a campus branch president. I got a phone call every 15 minutes during the waking day. The next 2 nights I stayed up, not only for therapy, but in order to write the first draft of that play, which, as you know, was more than just another play at BYU. It was a happening. It was a sensation. And the final week of the many long extended runs we had of it, I saw students sitting in serpentine circles on the floor of the Fine Arts Building waiting for the box office to open, kind of like you'd expect to be the case over at the Marriott Center for some athletic event. Yeah. Now, another happened after my return.
We're going to come back to that.
Okay. And another happened after that, my retirement. Rather than just sit on the porch and vegetate, which I think a lot of people sadly do after they retire, I had an occasion I wanted to find a pink pearl eraser, of all things. I had never, that'd been my favorite eraser for over the years, I think even when I was in junior high. And you couldn't find them anymore. So I thought there was a stationery store on Main Street in Bountiful. It's Carr's Stationery, K-A-R-R. And I thought maybe they would carry one. So I went there. They did have a pink pearl. I bought several. And then the clerk said to me, now if you go through that archive right there, it looked like it was part of the store. Not archive, what am I trying to say? That arch. You should look at the gallery. What gallery? There was an art gallery attached to it. They were renting it to the artists. I had no idea. I said, "What gallery?" And she pointed the way, and I went there. I had made a turn inside of the arch. The first painting I looked at was a pastel portrait of a young girl in a wool dress and a wool sweater. And for the first time in my life, I looked at a painting and said, "I want to do something like that." And then I looked at the signature of the artist. It was Anne Chesley. And I said aloud, "Who is Anne Chesley?" And a woman standing next to me, closer than you are, sitting across from me at this moment, said, "I am Anne Chesley," one of the artists there at the Lamplight Art Gallery. She was my first teacher, and I have been involved with them as one of the co-op members ever since. I've painted well over 500 portraits and many landscapes, from photos always. Photos I took while I was in Eastern Europe, in many of them of Swedish members and Russian members who came to the Swedish temple. I would take their picture, and then I do pastels. Did pastel portraits, particularly of the couples that I had sealed there at that temple. And
you become an accomplished artist. I own 2 prints of your works.
Yes, I'm flattered.
And you exhibit in a gallery in Bountiful. Yeah.
So anyway, that's how that happened. Another prompting, another odd prompting, you could almost say. I'd like to think that that's true for everybody, that those come into their lives. Why am I an exception?
Right. Well, I want to turn to the first 2 that you mentioned and kind of weave them together. Your first spot of time was a moment that confirmed you in a kind of discipleship. And then your writing of the Huebner play described a trajectory in which you explore some of the particular tensions in the life of a disciple. Gene England, by the way, called you the greatest playwright that Mormonism has.
I think he called me the father of modern Mormon drama.
I think he also said you were the greatest practitioner of the art as well. And that's a sentiment with which I'm in agreement. But it can't be a coincidence that your 2 most renowned plays, Huebner and Fire in the Bones, both describe a disciple caught in a particularly agonizing predicament.
That's right.
So I want you to talk about what those 2 plays have in common, why that particular kind of dilemma appeals to you. And if you wouldn't mind, for those tuning in, if you could give a very quick overview of each one of those plays, if they're not familiar with them.
Okay. Well, Helmut Huebner is, in my view, one of the perhaps greatest, most important martyr, LDS martyr of the whole 20th century. He was listening to BBC broadcasts in German. They were contradicting the propaganda that he was getting and others in Germany from
This would have been at the beginning of the war.
I wish I could recall the exact years now. It might or might not have been the beginning.
But it's after the rise of Hitler to power.
Oh, after Hitler's rise, yes. It was in Hamburg. That's where he lived. He ended up, he was the clerk to the district president of the church in Hamburg as a young man, only 16 or 17. And he used the mimeograph machine in the district office in order to turn out propaganda pamphlets arguing against Hitler and what he was doing. And then he recruited 2 other young LDS boys, friends of his, in Hamburg, to help him distribute them and clandestinely wherever they could in public places until they got caught and then arrested. And he was younger than the others. At their show trial in Berlin, the prosecuting attorney said that he had the mind of a 30-year-old professor, and therefore he deserved to be executed as an adult, which he wasn't. And by the existing law, he should not have been executed. But he took on the responsibility for the whole thing.
He was 17.
He was 17 when he was beheaded, yeah. And the other two were arrested. They were sent to the army and otherwise, and they survived, and they ended up in Salt Lake, both of them. I got to know them, and other principles in the whole story. His branch president was a Nazi himself, and I've made him look pretty good in the play. He did not know, in fact, about what Helmut was doing until after his arrest. But I have them have a confrontation, an agon, where they argue with each other about the merits or demerits of what he's doing, which I think is one of the better scenes in the whole play. There's another scene where his mother comes to visit him before his execution. That never happened either. She only learned about it when she saw it on a poster one morning in Hamburg, and so forth. But that's the story of Helmut Huebner. The other, which I wrote right afterward, deals with John D. Lee, who was a very valuable member of the church. He helped provision the saints when they came here in 47. And he was a great Indian representative. He negotiated with the Indians, farmer, and so forth. And he was actually, I think, Brigham Young's first adopted son, according to that tradition. But then we had Mountain Meadows Massacre, which he was foremost in leading, and later scapegoated, I believe, in order to find somebody to blame, and was executed also, like Helmut would be, after a federal trial in Salt Lake City. Well,
so they're certainly not parallel characters.
They're not at all,
and not exactly parallel predicaments. But what do they share?
Both were model members of the church who were both excommunicated before their deaths and executed. They had that in common. But there's another broader background that I didn't recognize at the time that came to my attention after I'd written even more plays. And I could see that they were all Oedipal, that I had a situation that had occurred to me, usually in somebody's biography, not made up, where a younger person was in contention with his parent or surrogate father, which the branch president was for Helmut Huebner, and which Brigham Young was for John D. Lee. And then I realized that this was me subconsciously reflecting my own crisis, conflict in these characters. I was relating to them, identifying with them that much. My father was committed to a mental institution when I was an infant, and he remained there for about 17 to 18 years throughout my youth, my childhood and youth, then returned to our family. So it was similar in that regard. I think, if you can ever psychoanalyze yourself, I think that was one of the factors. But then after writing those two plays, I suddenly realized I'm in a rut here. I'd better not write about excommunicants who have been executed, Now,
Huebner was rehabilitated, right?
They both were by the First Presidency. Subsequently, after World War II, he was. And then later also John D. Lee. So then I wrote a third play, which we had a number of stage readings of at the Y, with faculty from the Department of English who participated in those. And it's called Reunion. It's set during a general conference session in Salt Lake City, and where adult children come to be with their parents. One is a straight-laced high councilman who's a letter of the law type, and the other is a very permissive, liberal professor who is no longer an active member of the church. And they spar with each other. And my sense was that the ultimate truth must transcend their arguments. And that's represented by their father, their dying father, who was dismissed at one point as a seminary teacher for various reasons. And he wants to bring them together somehow. So that play ends. All of these plays ended with a ritual, which was like a libation or something. In this case, he asked his sons to bless him prior to the end of the curtain, including a younger son who's about to go on a mission, who becomes so disillusioned with the bickering of his older brothers that he's reconsidering going. And when the inactive professor son is asked by the father to be the voice for the blessing, he says, "Why me?" And his father answers, "It'll do you good." And we leave it at that. We don't have the prayer. In the case of John D. Lee, it's his execution. That play begins with his execution and ends with it. That's the frame of it. So
I don't know if you'd agree with my characterization of your work, but I'd say you're a disciples provocateur. Because you are committed. You continue to be deeply committed to your spiritual roots. And yet you've written, I'm just going to quote some of the phrases from your collected works.
Before you go on, let me just say, I don't know that I deserve such high praise because there are other wonderful Mormon playwrights who've come along, and Eric Samuelson is certainly one of those. And I have called Eric our propaganda, how does it go in Russian? Agit propagandist, agitational propagandist, for his discussion, his treatment of social issues, of real problems that occur in our social life together.
Right.
And so he deserves credit for that.
But here's one of the things that I like most about your writing and your message. You say that the problem is that we should be taking the gospel more, not less seriously. And that if we did, it would cause us to ask more questions. You've also suggested the good can be radical. One of our problems is we tend to stay in too close to the shore. And we want too comfortable a margin of safety. So what can you say about discipleship as a kind of risk-taking venture?
It needs to be that for all of us. And the people we read about in Scripture, the prophets and others, apostles in the New Testament, they had to do that, They had to make that. They had to walk the razor's edge, as Christ himself did. And I think that we need more of that challenge. I think it's available to us if we respond and go beyond just what is the normal expectation. But I think as a people, we were so much like, in the United States, for example, we're so much like members of our greater society who want comfort and who are so materialistic. And, there's that wonderful admonition in the Doctrine and Covenants that we should not wait to be commanded in all things, but do many things of our own free will. And some do, for sure, but many do not. And that's what I'm talking about. I call that condition the Mormon malaise. I think that's been used by others in another context, but the Mormon malaise. And I sense that around me. And here I am pointing the finger when I should probably be looking at where my thumb is pointing, But,
well, here's something else you wrote. This is actually a quotation from Richard Ellman, but I think it feeds into the same sensibility that you're trying to inculcate.
I quoted that in the book, right?
Yes, where he said, our responsibility is to save what is eccentric and singular from being sanitized and standardized.
Isn't that good?
Now, is this a problem or a challenge to Christian disciples everywhere, or do you think there's something about Mormonism that creates a uniquely vexing set of challenges, given how thoroughgoing it is in its organization, its forms, its structures, its guidelines?
I think we are far more structured as a confession than most any other that I can think of at the moment. And that has its merits, but we have a saying in our ward that's come down to us from one of our leaders there. Like he called it the simple six. That if we would just all adhere to the simple six, which included daily scriptural study, daily prayer, temple attendance, family home evening, and paying tithing, and attending meetings. I think that's what they are. And that's wonderful. That's what we all should be doing. Just this last week in our high priest group, I was quoting to them what I impulsively said to my wife a few days before. I said, there's one thing that's wrong with the simple six, and that's that if we're not careful, it persuades us that we don't have to do anything more. And it's more the letter than the spirit. It can become that. And that's what concerns me.
I've quoted this before in other contexts, but I'm powerfully moved by Marilyn Robinson's line in Gilead about living life beautifully is as important as living life morally. And one reason why I think that's true is because as Mormons, we still bear, I think, a burden of the Protestant heritage. We still tend to resort to a conception of God as this sovereign deity who has our lives laid out for us. And there's a blueprint that we're looking to find the blueprint.
Yeah, it's very regimented.
Yeah, and I'd like to think that it's more a question. No, he gives us a canvas and he says, paint a beautiful life. But that's where the risk is. We want to be... We want to feel like we're in the groove, right? We're following this preordained set of expectations, and I think he wants us to take more risk. It seems to me that what's the most powerful Mormon mythos is the way that we reconceptualize the Garden of Eden, and the lesson that seems to be taught from Joseph Smith's re-rendering of that story is that the adventure lies outside the garden.
I think I recall your saying that in your preface to somebody's book.
I may have. But it was your writing that prompted that
well,
observation.
What do you know? Well, I certainly agree with that. Yes, and I just think that we're too much in a rut at times, waiting to be commanded, to be told what we should do.
But it comes with a cost, right? I mean, you paid a price. Sometimes you were a little bit more provocative than some of the institutional voices we're comfortable with.
And I could have been punished in some form or penalized, but that didn't happen really, other than that I was prematurely released as director of the honors program because I'm quite sure they didn't want somebody in so prominent a position on the faculty in case the play created even more disfavor. Even though it was very popular with its audiences.
Well, it was a powerful, powerful message. And, we sometimes become so fixated on the Mormon pioneers of Utah that we haven't paid due deference to those in other countries and other times.
Indeed. I've had the great privilege of getting acquainted with the true pioneers of the church in the 20th century. And the first group were the East German members.
Right.
Who were living under communism, and they were just so valiant. And I had the great privilege before the wall, while in Berlin, to rub shoulders with a number of those people and their missionaries.
Right.
Then the second group, of course, were those green members who were the Russian members who joined right after the fall of the Iron Curtain, somewhat later. And just before we went there on our mission to St. Petersburg, Boy, what a spiritual feast that was.
My wife and I were recently invited by a wonderful, wonderful stake president in Albania to come visit his saints, and then to take a trip to Kosovo and speak to members in Kosovo.
Kosovo, no less.
And you spend a day with some of the saints in a place like that, and suddenly your first world problems and challenges seem pretty insignificant.
Well, they're among those pioneers.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, great people.
Yeah.
Paul Ricoeur, I think, referred to what he called the second innocence. And it seems that there's a challenge, especially for those who feel called to the life of the mind, that they develop what Dietrich von Hildebrandt called a hypertrophy of the intellect. And they so exercise their minds that their spiritual cells become a little bit calloused. And their apprehension and engagement of the gospel is more a kind of intellectual apprehension and commitment to certain ideas and doctrines rather than a feeling experience of the divine fire. And I think no message is maybe more relevant to this moment in our own history.
Well, it has everything to do with what we call the Spirit, and we invite that and we experience it in our interaction with others when we serve them at a very meaningful personal level. That's what we're supposed to do as home teachers and visiting teachers, and that does occur, I do believe. But that's also commanded. But there are immediate neighbors. There are members of our own family where we need to be able to minister, to serve one another better than we often do. Yeah, I agree fully.
I want to turn to some other passages where you give a kind of defense of beauty and the beautiful in art and literature as a particularly powerful prism through which to experience the gospel. So I'm reading from an essay called The Sacred in Literature. So I'm going to read two passages, and I'm going to ask you to comment on them.
That was the one forum address I gave at BYU.
Right. And this is from George Santayana.
Yes.
Beauty seems to be the clearest manifestation of perfection and the best evidence of its possibility. If perfection is the ultimate justification of being, we may understand the ground of the moral dignity of beauty. Beauty is a pledge of the possible conformity between the soul and nature, and consequently a ground of faith in the supremacy of the good. And then you go on to quote something even more specific, even a stronger claim by W.H. Auden. He said, every beautiful poem represents an analogy to the forgiveness of sins. Through its analogies, the goodness of created existence, the historical fall into unfreedom and disorder, and the possibility of regaining paradise through repentance and forgiveness are recognized.
Aren't those inspiring thoughts?
They're beautiful.
To claim one another, these souls that have come to inherit our DNA, and that's true of our ancestors vis-a-vis us as well. We are promised that we can have that relationship with them eternally. And the miracle of that, and we have that in common with all animals in terms of reproducing ourselves, and all plants for that matter. But it's a glorious connection. You know, I kind of think a lot of the essay that Phil Barlow wrote about God's, Joseph Smith's project. That's, I think, what he's referring to there. He calls it that. But surely he believes, as I do, that that was also revealed, and it's also God's project. That we
the fractured reality. That one.
I think so. That we unite ourselves through faith, eventually, as kin with everybody who has ever lived or ever will live yet. And when I think about what I would most like an angel to tell me someday.
Yeah, if you could ask an angel any one question, what would that be, Tom?
Would it be possible for us to get to know everyone that ever lived, in the eternities, why not? The great and the not so great, and including all of our ancestors and kin and our horizontally related kin, our cousins, and get to know them well and care about them that much, that we'd have that affinity and that concord between us. Could I really shake Dostoevsky's hand someday? And Gustav Mahler's, for example. Yeah.
I was going to ask what one thing you think Mormonism does really well, and is it related to this aspiration?
I think maybe so. The superstructure that we're given, and the opportunity in it to serve and minister to one another as lay people. You know, to me, one of the very obvious marks of the apostasy was when that process became professionalized and academic. And when a single person for his career would then do all of this for us, as it were. That sociality, have you ever heard that word anywhere else? Meaning, I think, socialization and fellowshipping that we now experience, and I'm paraphrasing, will be more perfect and glorious in the hereafter. Well, it certainly needs to be more real than it is. We need to be more interested and caring toward our fellow members on a ward level. And this varies from ward to ward. I recognize that. That's what I am really concerned about, that we be more that way. And certainly within our families. Someone said to me recently that, and I mentioned this too, and he said, he'd lived out of Utah, and he said, in Utah, we are mostly focused on our own families and their welfare, and I think we do that, and that's a wonderful thing. But it shouldn't stop at that at all. And Paul made that very clear to us when he said, "Ye are no longer strangers, but fellow citizens of the household of God." So, yeah. And there are some people who have that innate inclination and are that caring and giving to others. That varies with the personality too. But I don't think that means that we shouldn't all try to be more that way.
One last question. I'd like to conclude by asking about holy envy, Krister Stendhal's phrase about admiring to the point of envying something about another religious tradition that we would like to bring into our own. What would that be?
This might seem facetious, trivial, but I'm always enthralled, and I often try, when I'm in a Russian-speaking country, particularly in Russia, to attend a Russian Orthodox service and to listen to the a cappella singing. Now, I know that the people who do that for the service are professional singers. They probably get paid to do it, but it is so lovely. And I think there would be a way that we as a congregation could do that too. I've really felt so bad that certainly in Russia, and it might have been true even on my German mission, that the members were not trained the way we have been. We used to be in Sunday school with the singing practice to sing parts.
I remember, yeah.
But that doesn't happen over there. It's all just singing the melody together. But I really would rather not have organs or pianos, just the singing, if it could be like the Russians' services sing.
Beautiful.
And that's a very minor consideration, but there is a sense of reverence in those services for sure. Right. Even if the worship, the manner of worship, and here I'm becoming critical of them again, is very almost too submissive, and in the genuflexing, there are no seats. You stand and then you kneel and you kiss the floor in front of icons, and it's, I'm sure, an import from the tradition of the obeisance that was required of subjects to the czars
Right.
and to the earlier emperors. And that is not how we view our Father in
But the
heaven.
music is tremendous, and boy, their early theology especially, you look at the early Christian church fathers from the East, and
They had a sense of that,
beautiful,
didn't they?
Beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. So
Well, Tom, is there any question you wish I'd asked today that I didn't?
I can't think of any.
Well,
We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope that whatever I had to say made some sense.
Well, it did to me, and I'm really grateful to you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Terryl.
Thank you, Tom. So long.